Thank you for the introduction. I would like to begin actually by thanking the organizers of the conference, because in a sense I'm joining this group from the field of architecture, and I know that, as suggested in the previous keynote, that urban planners and architects can be part of the problem to begin with. But I wanted to contribute to this conversation, particularly from the field of architecture as a professor in the visual arts, hopefully to understand and share the role that architecture can play, and the visual arts, for that matter, can play in the rethinking, obviously, of human rights and economic justice. I also wanted to say that we are lucky, my co-director of the Blum Center on Cross-Border Poverty Research and Practice at UCSD, that we have a session tomorrow where we're going to elaborate on the interface between institutions and marginalized communities at the border. And I would like to take advantage also of this presentation to really contextualize the particular geography of conflict that we occupy at this very contested checkpoint or border region in the world. So I wanted to quickly begin, obviously, from the vantage point of my reflections on these issues as an architect, that it is clear, I guess, by now that the urban explosions that would qualify it as a greedy urban explosions of the last decades of economic boom also produce in tandem dramatic marginalization. And by that I mean the explosion of slums that occurred around many global capitals in the world. And in my mind, to begin with, obviously, it is this dramatic approximation between enclaves of economic wealth and the sectors of poverty that surround them that has produced unprecedented socioeconomic inequalities today. It is this, in fact, urban asymmetry which is at the center of today's urban crisis. I many times reflect on the fact that while many people, depending on their silo of specialization, might see the crisis as purely environmental or economic and political, I would like to begin by suggesting, obviously, that the crisis is particularly a cultural crisis. A crisis of the institutions, in my case, of planning and architecture and urban development, unable to rethink their own protocols, unable to rethink the stupid ways by which we have been growing, in a sense. I think that the future of urbanization today and the ideas, the best practices, the best ideas to rethink urban growth today will not emerge from sectors of privilege or, I should say, of abundance and economic power, but really will emerge from sectors of marginalization and conflict. It is, in fact, embedded in these environments of conflict where we can begin to imagine that the city will not be defined by buildings, particularly today, but really by the reconfiguration of socioeconomic relations first. And that's a question that I ask myself as an architect: how do we intervene ultimately in the reconfiguration and reorganization of those institutional practices? How do we mediate between the top-down and the bottom-up? And this is particularly the territory that I occupy with my practice as an architect. In the middle of this wall that separates the south from the north, this is the wall that separates Tijuana, Baja California, from San Diego in the US. And in many ways, this wall is the physicalization of conflict in the territory, transforming San Diego into the world's largest gated community. And in a sense, this solid wall is emblematic, in fact, of discriminatory urban planning policies that have continued to divide the city into an archipelago of enclaves out of urbanizations of fear and the fragmentation of jurisdictions and communities. At no other place, I think, in the world, even though these conditions are reproduced in every city in the globe, but I think at no other place in the world you would find some of the wealthiest real estate as the one found in the edges of San Diego, barely 20 minutes away from some of the poorest settlements in Latin America as the one found in the edges of Tijuana. This, again, radical proximity of wealth and power and poverty are really characterized and dramatized at this juncture. In my practice as an architect, I've been noticing and observing, documenting, researching the social practices of adaptation, as I call it, as I've been engaging the marginalized communities on both sides of the border, trying to rethink the very definition of the political from in my field, which I began to suggest it is really about what emerges out of the collision of the top-down and the bottom-up. I've been interested in investigating other ways of constructing city, in fact, by trying to interpret and translate the informal economies, the informal densities, and social organizational protocols that are embedded within these communities of practice, these marginalized enclaves. So I've been documented in the last years as a visual artist the transborder informal urbanization that transgressed this formidable barrier that divides these two cities. On one direction, the flow of immigrants as they travel north in search for dollars, and on the other, the flow of waste as the waste of Southern California enters into Tijuana to build the slums of that city. And this is in the shape of small bungalows from the early subdivisions of San Diego, the first ring of suburbanization of the post-war years. These are small bungalows waiting to cross the border from San Diego into Tijuana. So not only people cross the border, but entire pieces of one city move to the next. And when these small houses, discarded houses, are moved into Tijuana, they are put on top of these metal frames, leaving the first floor to become the second, to be infilled by more houses or maybe small businesses, etc. This sort of layered urbanization of retrofit and juxtaposition. Not only houses, but entire pieces of debris from one city to another. Probably you've seen in the past how people have recycled rubber tires to construct retaining walls. But look at what people do, obviously, in conditions of socioeconomic emergency. They have figured out how to peel off the tire, how to interlock it and clip it to produce a more efficient and more functional retaining wall in many of these slums. The garage doors from Southern California that are recycled en masse into Tijuana to construct emergency housing in many of these slums. So the garage doors of those older subdivisions now are the new skin for this emergency housing. Obviously, as an architect, I cannot help being seduced by these images, and I want to say I don't want to romanticize poverty here, but nevertheless, I'm witnessing an amazing creative intelligence embedded in this community and the knowledge transfer that needs to occur to really enable those conditions to really trickle up in order to transform urban policy and land use discriminatory regulation. So it is not about the images of poverty. I'm interested, obviously, in opening up to my field that behind this bricolage, there is also a series of socioeconomic procedures, political conditions of governance at very local levels that need to really be translated, interpreted, and ultimately translated into new modes of intervention. The informal here, as I tell my friends artists, is not just about an aesthetic category. It's in fact a praxis. I'm interested in the translation of a series of practices that can ultimately be translated into this debate. So while the recycling of waste is an important issue here, it is really the political economy of the recycling that is of interest in my research. Obviously, this recycling happens as maquiladoras, and this is one aspect that has been important in my reflection, is not only the image, but the procedures and the political economy of waste that is at stake here, but a series of conflicts that are produced by a variety of actors and institutions. How do we intervene in the midst of those relations? So I began to realize that the conflict between factories, labor, and housing is what defines many of these processes at the border. Factories that place themselves in the midst of these slums in Tijuana so that they can borrow labor without investing at all in improving the lives of many of these marginalized communities. So my intervention that I began to suggest in Tijuana had to do, as an architect, again, not to rush to the solution, in this case, to build housing. Sometimes I was reflecting on the keynote. In fact, many institutions of charity from the standpoint of architecture of humanity tend to perpetuate the problem by just building houses and not really constructing communities or rethinking the institutions embedded in the problem. So instead of rushing to the slum to construct housing, I decided to go to the factory and engage the maquiladora and many maquiladoras that are very close to these slums with resources, materials, and processes that could really be essential in rethinking infrastructure. So the factory, as a site of intervention, began to produce a project that we are at this moment developing, where some of the materials of those factories enabled by government subsidies, by triangulating those with very intelligent community activism and the accountability of factories to enter into the discourse, to really produce a small infrastructures that can begin to stitch that waste in more efficient manner. In that context, these small pallet racks are lightly adjusted by the designer in this case. I'm interested in how design enters really into the reorganization of the existing. It's not about new buildings, but it's about retrofitting the existing real. So these particular systems begin to enable the construction or supporting this temporal urbanization, this transformation of these environments through time. So this has been essential in the rethinking of infrastructure, because in many of these environments we can begin to imagine other meanings of infrastructure. Let's call it anticipatory infrastructure. I couldn't avoid but thinking to share this. I've been talking for 10 minutes right now, sorry. So this example of obviously slum in a very dangerous proximity of this train track to this environment, but in a matter of seconds after the train goes by, people restore obviously the market and it's back to operation. And I know that I'm not suggesting that we should reproduce these very risky and dangerous environments, but there is something about the informal that enables the negotiation of time, boundaries, spaces, and resources. And I'm interested in the intelligence of these practices so that we can rethink public space as flexible frameworks within which not only economy can be incentivized as local scales, but also other cultural and pedagogical processes. So while waste goes south, people go north in search for dollars, I was mentioning, and some of my research has really dealt with the impact of immigrants in the transformation of marginalized neighborhoods in the United States, particularly in Southern California. This is a story of a cross-border land use condition. So we have on the north in San Diego, the large chunks of land use from Southern California. It's very exclusionary, separating uses and so on. And to the south, what I already showed you very briefly, the pixelation of more compacted and dense uses in Tijuana. And I've been arguing that this confetti of alternative uses has begun to infiltrate itself into the largeness of this exclusionary zone in San Diego. So when this confetti hits the ground and is physicalized, it begins to transform the one-dimensionality, monocultural, and mono-use parcels of Southern California into alternative economies, obviously, and densities, as a family, an immigrant family might plug in an informal economy into a garage, or build a illegal granny flat in the back to support an extended family. I'm interested in the stories not only of this urbanization of retrofit, suggesting that immigrants are really producing the DNA in terms of transforming small parcels into socioeconomic microsystems that can then enable us to reimagine urban policy. Stories such as the informal Buddha, which is this small house from San Diego that did not travel into Tijuana, but ended up being transformed by these monks into a Buddhist temple. And in so doing, the house obviously is retrofitted into these other uses. I'm interested in the context of this story. There is not that much time to share the depth of some of these processes, but I'm interested in the role that these agencies play within these communities, these marginalized communities. The need for mediating agencies that can really produce new interfaces between institutions and communities. And the new political language that might emerge that can spatialize this acts of citizenship, as I call it, into a rethinking the language itself of urban development. Density has been reduced as a mere amount of objects per area, when in reality, in many of these informal environments, I think density can be understood instead as an amount of social exchanges per area. And times I've wondered how this could be visualized and how it can help us to challenge the top-down models of representation of the city. So marginalized neighborhoods as sites of cultural and socioeconomic production that can enable the rethinking of property, for example, between consumption, the urbanizations of consumption and production. And in essence, while in Tijuana, the site of intervention became the factory, in San Diego, a part of our research has been that it is in fact the developer's spreadsheet itself of development can be the site of intervention. How can we insert into this spreadsheet that, and the knowledge really embedded in this spreadsheet that manipulates resources and time very efficiently? How can we insert into this the hidden value of informal economy, sweat equity, collaboration, etc.? I would love to unpack this further, but there is no time here. I just wanted to suggest, without altering the very modes of financing and again of land use that have perpetuated one particular idea of property and ownership, is very difficult to advance issues of accessibility, democratization of urban development, and economic justice. Can the practice of two women who rent a 3-bedroom apartment, transforming it into an illegal nursery, be supported by some of the mediating agencies or NGOs in many of these neighborhoods, making funding accessible to them while protecting their presence? And these types of transactions and circulations are part of what we've been working with in many of these neighborhoods. So the economic pro forma as an instrument to construct community. This is what I wanted to suggest as another provocation from the vantage point of architecture. Finally, the rethinking of communities' role in co-producing housing. As these small parcels truly become small socioeconomic systems, there is no time here to explain this, but our housing projects in many of these impoverished neighborhoods in Southern California have begun to rethink housing as it has been perpetuated by developers as simple as an amount of units in parcels, but we are trying to figure out how we embed these units within an informal infrastructure of social service, collective kitchens, environments that are injected with socioeconomic and cultural program, facilitated and curated by the nonprofit organization that has become an alternative developer of housing. The transformation, again, of small parcels into more complex socioeconomic systems that are more accessible to different modalities, let's say, of housing economy. I would like to finish by, it's been 16 minutes so far. I would like to finish by suggesting how, by understanding the specificity of this scale at very compressed sort of environments in these neighborhoods, we can begin to reimagine the border region. In fact, these two neighborhoods, all the images that I showed you in this brief presentation come from these two neighborhoods on both sides of the border. To the north, the first immigrant neighborhood into the United States. To the south, the last slum of Latin America towards the United States. The idea is, again, how by understanding, translating, researching the specificity of these conditions, we can begin to reimagine the border region. Let's put it as a kind of neighborhood-based urbanization. This opened up an interesting diagram in my own practice as an artist when I discovered that the San Diego-Tijuana border is in the same corridor, global corridor, connecting itself to other contested geographies of conflict, linking itself to Ceuta and Melilla, the Strait of Gibraltar being the main funnel of migration from North Africa into Europe, even the Israeli-Palestinian border between the 30 to 35th degrees north parallel. I ended up calling this the political equator. And this, again, enabled the possibility that, again, by understanding the role of these marginalized communities in these sectors at the global scale, we can begin to reimagine governance and linking in more critical ways the global, obviously, and the local. But when we zoom into this territory very quickly, again, the neighborhood of San Isidro to the north and the informal settlement of 85,000 people living in this shanty town in Tijuana, crashing against the border, and in between them, the Tijuana River estuary. Which is an environmentally protected zone at the border that now has been overlaid with militarization. As we get closer in that little square to the territory, we have the border, and we have the shantytown crashing against the borderline or the border wall, and this is how the slum crashes against the border. In the distance, you see the estuary on the US side. Obviously, the idea that at this very juncture it cannot get any more visual, any more clear, the collision of the informal and the formal, the environmental, the militarization, density and the sprawl, and so on. After 9/11, Homeland Security claimed this territory of 200 feet parallel to the border, destroying all the canyons that are tangential to the border. And at this very moment, they are building the third wall, which is under construction. And you can see here the shantytown that has begun to erode a lot of the topsoil of the hills. and on the other, the environmental zone. After 9/11 began to build this wall, it has intensified the flow of trash coming from the shantytown into the estuary. And it is at that place of conflict, as the trash that now was imported into Tijuana is circulating back into San Diego, ironically, but is really contaminating this environmental zone. I wanted to close with this a reflection, because I've been interested in the curatorial practice, curating conversations that really occupy not the auditorium of the university, but in fact the very contested landscapes of conflict, so that the conversation can be reorganized by experientially occupying those environments. So we negotiated a special permit with Homeland Security to place our conference right there within that jurisdictional zone, in the shape of a conference that brought together Homeland Security, community representatives, activists, scholars, artists, and politicians, the mayors of San Diego and the mayors of Tijuana, the former mayor of Medellin, to discuss the issues. An agonistic process of opening and exposing the mechanisms by which these institutions are colliding and not negotiating critically. After that discussion that I would love to tell you more about, but I wanted to close with this image of a public action that we were able to perform as we convinced Homeland Security. A year took us to really get this special permit to transform a drain, a sewer drain that has been recently built by Homeland Security, transforming it for 24 hours into an official port of entry from the estuary or the environmental zone into the slums, so that the mayors could really witness this site of collision. And this is a moment when the 300 people who came to the meeting across the many demographics I mentioned, we begin to walk towards the wall. Obviously, it would be great, to explain more about the process, but I just wanted to show you the image of the new wall that has been built in the last 3 years. It's a huge concrete wall with a new drain, but behind that there is 85,000 people in this slum in Tijuana. And here we are lining up with our passports in hand, because it was an official port of entry, and the audience crossed in an unprecedented way the border. And on the south end, Mexican immigration waiting for us to stamp our passports. And as they are stamping our passports, we see the sewer and the trash flowing into the estuary. Obviously, this negotiation between the Homeland Security, Mexican immigration, to expose and visualize the issues of concern at this very juncture begins to redefine, obviously, not only citizenship across environmental shared rights in these two cities, but also enable us to not only curate the interface between the urban policy and public imagination in this case, but also opened up the path for a memorandum of understanding between these two municipalities to create policies that really target these particular sites. And that's something that I hope we can maybe elaborate further tomorrow when we get another turn. Thank you very much.